we're now going to go to Sheila Jeffreys, who will introduce the book and launch it.
Thanks very much, Jo. Hello, sisters. It's lovely to be able to speak with you today about Janice Raymond's new book, Doublethink, for which all of us have been waiting with great anticipation. I'm going to talk mainly about the general importance of Janice's body of work, both to feminism and to me. Doublethink is the most recent work from her, but her contributions to feminism throughout her life so far have been extraordinary. Back in 1989, when her very significant and first book, The Transsexual Empire, The Making of the She-Male, was published, I was heavily involved in radical, or as we called it, revolutionary feminist politics in London. We all read the book because we needed it so badly. We were fighting against the incursion of a few transvestites into women's events at that time. The great majority of UK radical feminists supported an entirely women-only politics, community and culture, and we had no doubt that the transvestites were men. They were not allowed in. Then Janice's book came out and we were absolutely thrilled. It was so well researched and written and really exposed the trans-industrial complex that created this problem we are having. Jan's book might have been controversial with the early transvestite rights movement in the US, but it was well supported by feminists and swathes of the medical profession, who also believed at that time that cutting up a man's body and putting him on hormones was an unethical response to mental distress. The very well-known and respected radical psychiatrist Thomas Szasz wrote a glowing review of it for the New York Times. His book, The Myth of Mental Illness, published in 1961, which is little known now, was central to the ideas of the radical psychiatry movement and to the feminist critique of the diagnosis and treatment of women's mental health that existed at that time and exists no more. Szasz completely agreed with Jan's feminist analysis. His review was titled, Male and Female Created, He, Them. It's an unfortunate biblical reference, but otherwise a headline which would be considered absolutely unacceptable in today's climate of radical indeterminacy. The book articulated our arguments. It was the first book critical of transvestism written by a feminist, and pretty much the last until I wrote Gender Hurts in 2014. Jan was a philosopher of science, and radical feminist philosophy was exactly what we needed. Jan forecast a good deal of what would take place, though as she notes in Doublethink, she could not have imagined quite how far the transsexual empire would go in transforming and dominating policy, language, and culture all over the world by the time this new book was written. In the late 70s in London, there were just 2 transvestites that I knew of creating trouble, not the thousands demanding their sexual interests be serviced by a massive social transformation that is happening now. But Jan could see into the future. She knew the empire would have huge effect, just not quite how much. In Doublethink, Jan gives a clear and alarming picture of just how far the empire has gone, and in this sense provides an excellent bookend to her first tour de force. I have been lucky enough to have a long association with Jan since I first met her in the US in 1986. I went out to spend a year teaching at a college in Worcester, Massachusetts, as a Fulbright scholar from 1985 to 6. I sent out letters before I went to those US rad femmes who were my inspiration, including Andrea Dworkin, Catherine McKinnon, Adrienne Rich, and Janice Raymond. Jan is one of that quite small number of US radical feminists who informed and inspired us over the pond in the UK. The UK did not have radical feminist stars or the wonderful books of radical feminist theory they produced. I was in awe of these radical lesbian feminists, and certainly in awe of Jan, when she agreed to meet with me. I was thrilled to discover that she'd already read my first book, The Spinster and Her Enemies. I saw myself as a newcomer, lucky to meet with the established leaders of the movement. Then Jan wrote her next book, The Wonderful Passion for Friends, which I hope we will be discussing soon in the RadFem Perspective series, which takes place on Sunday mornings. A Passion for Friends, a philosophy of female friendship from 1986, is a much-loved work of lesbian feminist theory, fascinating and so positive about our lesbian lives. I met Jan again when she came to the UK to promote the book. An indication of the significance of that book for the feminist movement in the UK is the fact that it was named the best non-fiction book of the year by the UK alternative magazine, City Limits. In 1987, Jan and I both spoke at a very important conference in New York at the New York University Law School, organized by New York Women Against Pornography. It was called The Sexual Liberals and the Attack on Feminism, to encapsulate its purpose, which was to fight back against the great backlash being waged against anti-pornography and anti-sexual violence radical feminism by liberal feminists and gay male sadomasochists and lefty sexual revolutionaries. The forces of male domination were being marshaled powerfully at that time against those of us, and there were many of us, who were campaigning against pornography in the US and the UK. Speakers at the conference included Jan, Andrea Dworkin, Phyllis Chesler, Catherine McKinnon, and Mary Daly. I was the only non-American. The papers became the 1990 book of the same name, which is available to download online. At the conference, Jan articulated her sharp critique of liberal feminism in a talk entitled Sexual and Reproductive Liberalism. We radical feminists were at that time under a battering onslaught of liberal feminism, which poo-pooed all our work against pornography and much of that against sexual violence too. The liberal feminists were saying that it was empowering for women to be able to choose to be in pornography, prostitution, or surrogacy, or baby trafficking. All these forms of violence and abuse of women were turned into their opposite. They were subjected to what Mary Daly called a patriarchal reversal, as women's pain and exploitation were promoted as wonderful opportunities for women. Jan's critique of liberal choice feminism in all her work has been critical, hugely useful to other scholars or to other scholars today. Some of the talks from that wonderful conference I had on a cassette tape, which we were allowed to purchase at the event, and these are online. I'm hoping that all of the talks I did not have, including Jan's 2 presentations, are under some woman's bed and will also make it into an online archive. My political development into anti-prostitution politics meant that I would have the pleasure of working with Jan in the 1990s, when she was involved in running the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, and I set up the Australian branch of that organization. Jan was a director of CATWA from 1994 to 2007, and is still on the board. CATWA expanded hugely internationally during this time and has been of critical importance in spreading the understanding that prostitution is violence against women and opposing the legalization of the sex industry. I was involved in this work from setting up the Australian branch in 1994 to when I left Australia in 2015. It was my pleasure to be able to speak on panels with Jan on prostitution, in Korea, for instance. We have both published books on prostitution and on transgenderism. Jan's book, Not a Choice, Not a Job, Exposing the Myths About Prostitution, was published in 2013. We have both experienced considerable harassment during our work on prostitution because there is a crossover between pro-prostitution and pro-transgender activists. Jan describes some of the attempts to prevent her doing her anti-prostitution work by activists against both SWERFs, sex worker exclusionary radical feminists, and TERFs, transgender exclusionary radical feminists, in a chapter describing the woeful campaign to exclude her books and those of other radical feminist anti-violence against women works, and including my own, from libraries and universities, for instance, as well as the forms of very serious harassment that many feminist academics, researchers, writers, and activists have been subjected to. There are important crossovers between prostitution and transgenderism, such as the way in which young boys and men internationally are effeminized so that they can be used in prostitution, such as the Fa'afafine in Samoa, ladyboys in Thailand, Hijra in India. But these connections are never discussed critically. Anti-prostitution activists continue to face the joined-up attacks on us as SWERFs and TERFs. My path and Jan's path have run along similar tracks. We've both been very proud lesbian feminists and activists against prostitution and written books about that, as well as working against the transsexual empire. And this is not coincidental. Radical feminists like us have always understood and worked against the use and abuse of women's bodies that lies at the basis of male domination in prostitution, pornography, and surrogacy. Jan has written against the abuse and exploitation of women in the reproductive technology industry, as well as the trafficking in women that's involved in surrogacy, in her book, Women as Wombs, Reproductive Technologies, and the Battle Over Women's Freedom, which was published in 1993 and by Spinifex in 1995. Caring about women's bodies, women's natural bodies, as Jan puts it, is something that is rejected by liberal feminism. Jan's critique of liberal choice feminism in all her work has been critical. Jan and I both care very much about the exploitation of women's fleshly bodies, and Jan's voice on these issues is of huge importance. I remember back in 1996 seeing and hearing Jan at the conference Violence, Abuse and Women's Citizenship, which was organised by Jana Hanma and held in a seafront hotel in Brighton. We were both speaking. I remember well that I said to Jan, I went up to her and said after she had spoken that she had a wonderful moral authority in her speaking. And she replied to the effect that I did too. So I was very well surprised and pleased that she should think so. That conference, I understand to have been the last to take place before the rapid decline of the women's liberation movement got underway. I know too that all the found recordings of the talks given there under her bed or in the cellar or somewhere, and that they will at some point be available for us to hear again. At this time, we are at a very important point in the struggle against the transsexual empire. Jan states in her book that it isn't a sequel, but it does, however, make an excellent job of describing the most disturbing effect of the empire's power, particularly the effect upon lesbians who are being transgendered in a detailed chapter on lesbian issues. She includes the harassment and sexual violence against lesbians by men who pretend to be lesbians to gain sexual access. This previously little known issue has come to prominence in the UK just in the last week, with the publication by BBC News of a lengthy article describing the problem, supported by Angela Wilde's research which Jan also uses. The backlash to the BBC for that article was swift, with 10,000 people writing to complain that the preference that lesbians have for women rather than men is transphobic and like racism. But the BBC held firm. Doublethink is a most welcome book for Janice's friends and admirers who are legion in the radical feminist community. Once, back at the time of the women's liberation movement, we would await with huge eagerness the next volume that one of the wonderful radical feminist theorists of that time would produce. Jan is one of the very few still to be writing, and it is good that our patience has been rewarded with this book. I have been thinking since we've been talking, and Jan talks very much in her book, about the crucial importance of detransitioners. And I was thinking that, a few years ago, when I did Gender Hurts, I was telling people that I thought there were two things that would change the success of these men. One would be a movement of detransitioners, and that is now happening, and that's really, really important, because in the end, they cannot be ignored. And the other was a movement by the trans widows, as they now tend to be called. That is the women who've been married to these men, because these are two constituencies of women that have been absolutely hugely harmed. And back in 2014, I couldn't find anything about the wives. I found only one detransitioner to talk to. It was very hard in those days. And it's quite different now. And there's the Trans Widows website online. Lots of women are speaking out. They have got no coverage in the media, though. Detransitioners have. They've got out there. We see stuff about detransitioners. We don't see anything yet about the trans widows. And I'm hoping this is really going to change, because there are huge, huge numbers of them. when you look at the comment threads in Mumsnet and other places, women all the time are coming out and saying, yes, my husband did that and my partner did that. And it was enormously in common. And indeed, a boyfriend of mine way back in the dark old days when I was briefly heterosexual, also, I know, dressed up in clothes of mine, which he left out on the bed to show me. So this is enormously common. It's a huge problem for women, and that needs to come out. But I'm very, very pleased that we've got as far as we have with detransitioners, I have to say. In relation to transgenderism and prostitution, it's really, I think, is it not, only those two areas in which we have had huge protests against feminists and violence against feminists, and the men really coming out against us. I don't think there's any other issue. And of course, in the old days, they didn't care about us anyway. So the men are becoming violent now in a way that they never, ever did. But it's interesting that it's those two issues. So I'm not quite sure exactly how they're joined up, but there's a way in which those two issues are obviously enormously threatening to the project of male domination. It's just interesting that it is those two. And those of us who've been active in both of those areas, as I have, as Jan has, we see these men come together in very violent ways, and we have suffered from both of them. But it's just interesting how those things work together.